All right, hopefully you found that video interesting and informative as far as what's going on. Let's go ahead and move into what's going on with the human embryo relative to other creatures' embryos. So you'll see that the human is on the right-hand column, and the left-hand column is a fish, the next one in is a salamander, the next one in is a tortoise. Just look at row A as I'm naming these. So far left, row A, fish, compared to next one in being salamander. I think you'd have to be a fish versus salamander expert to be able to tell the difference between those two embryos, I'm going to guess. Then we move to tortoise, something that's going to have a shell on its back. Looks pretty darn similar to a fish and a salamander, doesn't it? Chick is next, then there's rabbit, and then finally on the far right is human. So as you're looking across that top row, you can see that there's a lot of similarity when creatures of very different outcomes in the long run are compared just during the embryonic period. There's an old saying that some of you might have heard, and some of you might be like, oh yeah, I say this saying all the time. The saying goes, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And what that phrase is saying is that ontogeny, which is another word for saying development during pregnancy or gestation, the development during gestation recapitulates, which means sort of goes back through those same stages as phylogeny, which is referring to evolutionary history. So what they're saying is that during the stages of development, fetal development, embryonic development, that we go through the same stages that our, long ago ancestors went through. And that's why we see so many similarities in row A among very different creatures. Now, if you go to row B, we've moved a little bit along in development, and okay, we can tell a fish and salamander are vastly different from tortoise, chick, rabbit, and human, right? You can really see a difference between those two on the left-hand column. One reason for that is that we diverged a long time ago on the evolutionary tree from fish and salamander, and less distantly from tortoise, chick, rabbit, and human, right? So that there's a lot more similarity. But notice tortoise and chick look a lot more like each other in row B, and rabbit and human look a lot more like each other. So you can kind of see mammal versus non-mammal. You can't say a tortoise and a chick are both birds, but they sure do have similarities, don't they? They both have kind of beaks. They have some similarities. Even on row C, they still look more similar to each other than the rabbit and the human do. And obviously row C is not at birth. This is still during fetal development that we're on row C. Because there's a lot more differentiation that has to happen where we're going to, by birth, be able to tell a rabbit from a human. I can guarantee you that. I can definitely tell them apart at birth. But I think this panel is really an interesting one to look at because it really gives us that perspective of, ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. Really, you can see during the stages of gestation that you sort of go back through what happened during evolution. Okay, so that's just a fun thing I thought I'd throw in there. Very specific to development. There's something that's going to sort of haunt us throughout, all the way up until adolescence. I will keep referring to these two principles. One is the principle of cephalocaudal development. So the cephalus is the head and the caudal is the tail. The caudus, I think, is the tail. So what cephalocaudal development tells us is that development is going to proceed from the head to the tail. So the head is going to be more fully developed earlier than the tail is going to be. So in a human, the tail is, the rump, your butt, your legs, your feet. That's the tail end. And the caudal end is going to be your big giant head with your big brain in it, right? And the development of the brain and the head occur much earlier than the rump, the legs, the toes. Those are going to come down later. Proximo Distal is the other principle of development that's going to follow us up until adolescence. Proximo means near, distal means far. So your near portions, your head, your torso, are going to develop before your distal regions, your arms and your hands and your feet and your your legs. And we can see that in the difference between, in the top panel, 49 plus 1 day of gestation in the top panel. In the bottom panel, we see 52 plus 1 day. So it's only 3 days different, 4 days different in calculation between the top panel and the bottom panel. But what you can really see that has started to develop in the bottom panel is the arms and the legs and the toes and the fingers and so on. The head is big already in the top panel. Here we are 56 plus 1 days, so let's just call it another week. Now we're starting to see that the toes have separated, right? So as development proceeds from top down and from center out, we're going to see things developing on the head. We're going to see things developing on the torso before we see things in the distal areas of the arms and legs and in the lower levels. So like the arms will develop before. Notice that in the bottom row, the left panel, it says the fingers separated and the toes don't separate until the right panel. So you see that top down, right? So arms before legs. And then proximo distal, arms before hands, legs before toes, like that. And we're going to see that throughout. Now here we have sort of size depiction of what the developing embryo and into fetus would look like size-wise. If you go onto a pregnancy website, for some reason they always compare the developing embryo and fetus to food. It's about the size of a sesame seed, it said in the video that I put in the playlist. Which is helpful. I guess we know how big a sesame seed is, but some of them are kind of ambiguous. They'll say things like, it's about the size of a plum. And it's like, an Italian plum? Or one of those purple skinned but yellow fleshed plums that are much bigger than an Italian plum. What kind of plum are we talking about? So I don't ever find those food comparisons all that helpful. This is really specific, showing all the way over on the very left, very, very tiny, the beginning of the embryonic stage. And over here on the right would be, given the development of the legs and the arms, I would say that this is probably on the far left. Sorry, I said left. The far right, the biggest one, is probably the beginning of the fetal period. So you see a lot of growth and development while still staying relatively small, because we've got a human hand in there for perspective. So that you can realize that as the embryo transitions over into the fetal stage, it's got like all of its body parts there in that far right picture, but it's only about 3/4 of an inch long. So very small still, but the body parts, the structures, externally at least, look like they're all there. I'm really being careful to not imply that the brain is fully developed yet, but at least the body looks like you would expect it to look. All right, speaking of which, I wanted to spend a moment talking about things that can interfere with healthy development. These are called teratogens. When I was a student, I misread it as teratogens. So if you read it like that at first too, you're in my same team. But it's teratogens. And these are substances that can interfere with normal development. So this can be a lot of different kinds of things that can serve as a teratogen. Here is a chart that shows you across the top how many weeks of development since conception. So this chart starts counting at the point of conception and then on. This is a little different from how doctors track pregnancy. This is a different counting system. So this is from the point of conception on. And then along the left-hand side, you can see the different systems that are developing, central nervous system, heart, arms, legs, lips, ears, eyes, teeth, palate, and sex organs. Okay, the far left two columns, weeks 1 and 2, are kind of off by themselves with nothing really, no coloring in their rows, because in those first 2 weeks, the blastocyst hasn't implanted yet. So we haven't really officially entered the embryonic period. And because the blastocyst hasn't implanted yet, it's very unlikely that a teratogen would have an effect, because the blastocyst is not collecting any kind of food or nutrition or anything from mom's bloodstream yet. So at this point, it's just in its own self, using its own nutritional reserves and those kinds of things. So the first 2 weeks are not going to be impacted by teratogens. We start with week 3. So what you see is that the orange areas, the areas that are colored orange, are what we call highly critical periods. So if a teratogen is present during this point in development, there's a very high probability that there will be a negative effect from it. The purple areas are less critical, where if something was present, it may or may not have an impact on the developing embryo. So let's focus on the orange parts then. So the central nervous system is very rudimentary in the first couple of weeks after conception. And so, in weeks 3, 4, and 5, that's when the spinal column is rolling around over itself to create the spinal column. It was flat, and now it has to roll around and develop the actual vertebra and stuff that will encase the spinal cord. And so this is the point when it's really common for neural tube defects to occur. This is oftentimes referred to as spina bifida, when you have a gap in the bony structures that are supposed to be protecting the spinal cord. So that typically happens in weeks 3 through 5 after conception. When we start moving into weeks 6, 7, 8, and beyond, we're more likely to have teratogens damage areas of the brain or layers of the brain that could lead to the medical term for it is mental retardation. We don't like to use that in common parlance anymore, so we would use a phrase more like cognitive difficulties, something like that. The next row down, the heart is most likely to be affected by a teratogen during the periods about 3.5 weeks to about 5.5 weeks, 6.5 weeks, something like that. And you can end up with the heart not being encased in the rib cage. You could have heart valve defects. You can have ventricular defects, different kinds of things going on. The arms have their critical period for development in weeks 4 through about 5 3/4. Legs a little bit later than that because of cephalocaudal development. The lips and the palate are developing in weeks 5 and 6, so you can end up with cleft lip. You can end up with cleft palate more in weeks 6 into 7. The sex organs don't really start to develop until around 7.5, 8 weeks after conception, and so you can end up with teratogenic effects on the developing sex organs about that time. Eyes are developing in weeks 4.5 to 8, 8.5, something like that. Ears are developing right about that same time, a little earlier and a little later for the ears. So there are times when really big structures are developing that could lead to big effects like deafness or blindness or a cleft palate or a cleft lip or heart problems or missing limbs or things like that. So you probably are, and then if we keep going on, I wanted to just show you all the way through the rest of pregnancy. You'll notice really the developing brain is the one thing that seems to have, a highly critical period that extends well into, the end of the second trimester. So as the brain is organizing itself, things, the neurons are being born and organizing into layers and those kinds of things, you can get really profound effects all the way up till the end of the second trimester, for sure. The third trimester, you get really, it's a less critical period, it's a sensitive period, and you may end up with more along the lines of learning disabilities or ADHD or these kinds of effects that are a lot harder to pin down than the kinds of profound effects that we would see up to the end of week 16. So what I wanted to talk about just briefly is like the kinds of things that can serve as teratogens. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things. One is alcohol. It wasn't recognized as a teratogen until about 1972 when a med student at the University of Washington noticed that moms who were visibly drunk when they came in to deliver babies were delivering babies that had physical features that looked very similar. And now that constellation of physical characteristics is called fetal alcohol syndrome. It not only has these physical characteristics, but typically has lower IQ as one of the symptoms. So it has a psychological component to it, a brain-based component to it as well. There's a sensitive period also for alcohol exposure that's towards the end of pregnancy, and you can end up with learning disabilities and things like that if you have a mom who's consuming a lot of alcohol. The question is, how much alcohol would it take to have a teratogenic effect? And we really don't know. So what most women who are worried about that will do if they become pregnant is to avoid all alcohol. And that's obviously the safest thing that we can do because we don't know how much alcohol it would take. There are so many variables that would go into that, your body size, your history of drinking, other kinds of things. And so the safest thing to do is just not drink at all. But we don't know that you have to not drink at all. We don't have evidence for that. Most of the women who were coming in and delivering while visibly drunk were not admitting that they had drunk a lot of alcohol across their pregnancy. And so it's really hard to get good data on it. We can't do experiments on things like that. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that we have a society where people will shame a pregnant woman for doing things that may or may not actually be harmful to their developing fetus. But we feel like entitled to say something, and we don't know how much alcohol it would take for harm to come to the fetus, and we definitely do not know whether there is a harm to be had for a nursing child if a mom drinks. So I just wanted to put that out there, that a lot of times people feel entitled to say something when they really don't. They don't have the science to back that up. We really can't say that that's true. The other teratogens I wanted to talk about are cigarettes, which are, their biggest teratogenic effect is to deprive the fetus of oxygen. Cigarette smoking constricts blood vessels, including those that feed the developing fetus through the placenta. And so you end up with a smaller baby, a baby who might have heart problems and things like that as a function of not having had adequate oxygen for sure, and then also nutrition, because with the constricted blood vessels, they're not going to get nutrition either. Also, waste can build up in the developing fetus because they can't transfer it across those constricted blood vessels. Other things that are teratogenic that we know of for sure are things like cocaine. Other stimulants can really interfere with the developing fetus and embryo, and so we want to make sure that we're avoiding things like cocaine, methamphetamines, things like that. Now, caffeine was thrown into that same category of stimulants, and unfortunately, when the initial research on caffeine was conducted, they didn't isolate women who were only caffeine consumers away from women who were caffeine consumers and smokers. A lot of people who smoke cigarettes also consume caffeine, and so if you look at the old original research, it implied that no amount of caffeine would be considered healthy because there are these smaller babies and other things. More modern research has pulled out women who consume only caffeine and don't smoke, and they have found that a woman can consume up to 500 milligrams of caffeine without any apparent harm to their developing fetus. 500 milligrams of caffeine is a lot. That's an average 5-ounce cup of coffee, drip coffee, contains about 125 milligrams of caffeine. So I think it makes a lot of sense for a pregnant woman to limit her caffeine consumption, but probably not a lot of need for her to eliminate caffeine now based on the newer research. Other things that we know can be harmful are things like thalidomide, which was a drug that was developed to help women through morning sickness. So it was very often prescribed during the period from about 3 weeks to about 8 weeks after conception, which is exactly when arms and legs and hands and feet are developing. And what they found very quickly was that moms who were given thalidomide were tending to give birth to babies who were missing arms, legs, feet, hands. And so very quickly it was pulled from the market. But we now know that we have to be very, very careful about what women consume, especially in that period up to 8 weeks after conception, to avoid teratogenic effects. Finally, I'll just leave us with a couple of other teratogens. One is radiation exposure. There's a reason why if you're a female and you are being x-rayed for any reason, they'll ask if it's possible that you could be pregnant, because if we can avoid exposing a developing embryo to radiation, we can protect its developing brain. So we don't want to be exposing babies to that. So the other one I wanted to mention is measles, which all of us are required to be vaccinated against. Measles in a pregnant woman can interfere with the developing eyes of their fetus or their embryo. And so you can end up with a blind baby at the end because measles interferes with eye development. So those are some really big, really common teratogens that people might come into contact with. Hopefully that explains a little bit about how they work and how they can interfere with the healthy development of an embryo especially, and to a certain extent fetuses. All right, well, I will see you guys in the next section when we will talk about prenatal growth.